I don't know if anyone will read this, but I need to get it out. My therapist suggested journaling, but writing here feels more cathartic. Plus, maybe someone out there can relate, or maybe you all can help me make sense of the chaos that's been my life. So, I'm 26 now, but to understand why I'm so messed up, we've got to go back. Way back. I grew up in a small town in Indiana called Maplewood. It's one of those places that seems stuck in time, where everyone knows everyone else's business, and if you don't fit in, you might as well not exist. I guess I never really had a chance to fit in, though. From the moment I was born, my parents made it pretty clear they'd hoped for something else. Something I could never be. See, my parents, Greg and Marlene, always wanted a girl. They were obsessed with the idea of having a daughter. My mom used to talk about how she dreamed of dressing up her little girl, braiding her hair, and doing all the girly things. But then I came along. A boy, the wrong child according to them. I wasn't even named until 3 days after I was born, because they were too disappointed to think of a name. Eventually, they settled on Evan, a name my mom said was as plain as could be, as if even my name was a letdown. From as far back as I can remember, they made it clear I was not what they wanted. I remember my mom always being distant, cold. She'd dress me in old, worn-out clothes, hand-me-downs from some distant cousin, even though that they could afford better. But I think the worst was the lack of affection. She never hugged me, never told me she loved me. And my dad, well, he wasn't much better. He'd glare at me over his newspaper, grunt in response to anything I said, and the only time he paid attention to me was when I did something wrong. Then I'd get the belt or worse, depending on how much he'd been drinking that day. Maplewood Elementary was small, with just enough kids to form cliques. And of course, I didn't fit into any of them. From kindergarten on, I was the weird kid. I was small for my age, and my parents' neglect showed. My clothes were always too big or too small, shoes with holes in them, hair that was never quite right. The other kids noticed, of course, and they were relentless. The boys would shove me in the hallways, trip me during recess, and the girls, well, they'd laugh, whisper, and point. It wasn't just the bullying, though. It was the way they all looked at me, like I was some kind of freak. I never got invited to birthday parties, never had friends to sit with at lunch. The teachers noticed, but did nothing. I think they were just glad I was the one getting picked on and not one of the normal kids. There was one teacher, though, who was different. Mrs. Thompson, my 5th grade English teacher. She was probably in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back into a bun and glasses that made her look like she belonged in some old movie. But she was kind. She noticed me, really noticed me, in a way that no one else did. She saw that I was struggling, not just with the schoolwork, but with everything. And she helped me in ways that I'm only now starting to fully appreciate. Mrs. Thompson would stay after class with me, helping me with my homework, but also just talking to me. She never pried, but she made it clear that if I ever needed someone to talk to, she was there. I think she knew how bad things were at home, though I never told her. How could I? Even back then, I was ashamed. But she was the one who noticed when I came to school without lunch, the one who quietly slipped me a sandwich or a granola bar when no one was looking. Sometimes she'd even bring me extra clothes, just lost and found stuff, she'd say, but I knew better. Those clothes were the only ones that fit me properly, that weren't falling apart at the seams, and I cherished them, even if I had to hide them from my parents, who'd have taken them away out of spite if they knew where they came from. But Mrs. Thompson's kindness was a double-edged sword. It didn't go unnoticed by the other kids. They saw that she cared about me, and that just made them hate me more. They'd sneer at me, call me teacher's pet, or worse. I remember one time during recess, a group of boys cornered me behind the gym. They started pushing me around, laughing, and then one of them, Tommy, I think his name was, pulled out a knife. It was just a small pocket knife, but to a 10-year-old, it looked deadly. He pressed it against my throat, hard enough that I could feel the cold metal, and said, "Maybe we should just get rid of you now, freak." I was terrified, shaking so hard I thought I'd pass out. But then, out of nowhere, Mrs. Thompson appeared. I still don't know how she knew, but she was there, and she didn't even hesitate. She grabbed Tommy's wrist, twisted it until he dropped the knife, and then she dragged him to the principal's office by his ear. The other boys scattered like rats. Tommy got suspended, and the principal called my parents. But when I got home, instead of comforting me, my dad just sneered, "What kind of boy lets himself get pushed around like that?" I didn't answer. What was there to say? After that, things got worse. The bullying didn't stop, but it became more secretive, more sinister. The boys who used to shove me around now just whispered threats, promising to get me when no one was watching. They'd steal my lunch, throw my books in the toilet, and once, they even locked me in a janitor's closet for hours after school. My parents didn't notice I was late getting home, and when I finally did, dirty and exhausted, they didn't ask why. And Mrs. Thompson, well, she tried. She really did. But she couldn't be everywhere, and I think even she started to realize that she couldn't protect me forever. The school year ended, and I moved on to middle school. I lost touch with her after that, but I never forgot what she did for me. She was the only adult in my life who ever showed me kindness, and that meant more than I could ever say. Middle school was its own kind of hell. The bullying continued, of course, but now it was mixed with the awkwardness of puberty and the realization that I was different in more ways than just my clothes or my size. I was starting to notice that I didn't feel the same way about girls that the other boys did. While they were all obsessing over crushes and first kisses, I was more interested in books, art, and music. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back, I realized that I was struggling with my sexuality in a place where anything different was met with scorn. My parents only made things worse. They'd always been distant, but as I got older, their disdain turned into outright hostility. My dad would make snide comments about how I acted like a girl or wasn't man enough. My mom started going to church more, dragging me along, and she'd pray loudly for God to fix whatever was wrong with me. I didn't know what she meant then, but I do now. By the time I got to high school, I was a mess. I was anxious all the time, afraid to go to school, afraid to go home. I had no friends, no support, and no idea how to cope. I started skipping school, hiding out in the woods behind our house for hours, just to avoid everyone. I'd steal food from the kitchen in the middle of the night because I didn't want to sit at the dinner table with my parents, and they didn't care. They didn't ask where I was, didn't seem to notice I was gone. Then, something happened that changed everything. One night when I was 15, I came home to find the house dark and silent. That wasn't unusual. My parents often went to bed without saying goodnight. But there was something different in the air, a tension that made my skin crawl. I crept upstairs, trying to be as quiet as possible, but when I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it. A muffled cry, coming from my parents' bedroom. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe some twisted sense of curiosity, or maybe just the desperate need to know what was going on. I crept to their door and pushed it open just a crack. What I saw inside still haunts me to this day. My mom was on the floor, her hands tied behind her back, and my dad was standing over her, a belt in his hand. He was hitting her hard, and she was sobbing, begging him to stop. I was frozen, too terrified to move, but I couldn't look away. I just stood there, watching as my dad beat my mom until she stopped crying, stopped moving. I don't know how long it went on, but eventually he dropped the belt and walked out of the room, not even noticing me in the shadows. I ran back to my room and locked the door, shaking so hard I thought I'd be sick. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I didn't know what to do, who to tell. I couldn't go to the police. What would they do? Arrest my dad and leave me alone with my mom? And even if they did, what then? I'd be put in foster care, maybe split up from her, sent God knows where. No, I couldn't do that. So I stayed silent. After that, things at home got even worse. My mom was different, more withdrawn, more nervous. She flinched every time my dad raised his voice, and she stopped going to church. My dad was the same, though, cold, cruel, and indifferent to anything that wasn't about him. I think he knew I saw what happened that night, but he never said anything. He didn't have to. The fear was enough. As soon as I turned 16, I got a job at a local grocery store, just to get out of the house. I worked as many hours as I could, saved every penny, and started planning my escape. I knew I had to get out of Maplewood, out of that house, out of that life. But I also knew I couldn't just run away. I had to finish school, had to have some kind of plan, or I'd end up worse off than I already was. So I waited. I bided my time, endured the abuse, the bullying, the isolation. I kept my head down, stayed out of trouble, and focused on my goal, getting out. I didn't have anyone to talk to, no one to confide in. I was completely alone, and I knew it. But that was okay. I'd survived this long, and I could survive a little longer. Finally, graduation day came. I walked across that stage, got my diploma, and didn't look back. I packed my bags, left a note for my parents that I doubt they even read, and caught the first bus out of town. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. Anywhere was better than Maplewood. I'm 26 now, and I still feel like that scared, lonely kid from Maplewood. I've tried therapy, but it only helps so much. I have a job, but it's just that. A job, not a career. I've had a few relationships, but they never last. I'm too messed up. After I left Maplewood, I thought my life would get better. It had to, right? I was out of that hellhole, away from my parents, away from the constant bullying. But life has a funny way of kicking you when you're down. It turns out, just because you leave a place doesn't mean you leave the baggage behind. I ended up in Indianapolis, the closest city with any real job prospects. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I rented a tiny, dingy apartment in a building that was older than my grandparents'. The walls were thin, the plumbing was unreliable, and the neighbors were, well, let's just say they kept to themselves. But it was mine, and that was something. I found a job as a sales agent at a company called Home Goods Direct. The name sounds fancy, but it was anything but. We sold cheap household products, everything from kitchen gadgets to cleaning supplies to whatever else people might be convinced they needed but didn't really want. My job was to cold call people, trying to get them to buy stuff they didn't need with money they didn't have. I hated it from the start. The calls were brutal. People would hang up on me, curse at me, and sometimes just laugh in my face. I can't say I blamed them. I wouldn't want someone calling me in the middle of dinner, trying to sell me a mop or a blender. But I needed the money, and this was the only job I could get with no experience and no real skills. The people I worked with were a mix of desperate and defeated. There was Gary, a guy in his 40s who had been at Home Goods Direct for over a decade. He was a lifer, stuck in a job he hated because he didn't know how to do anything else. His eyes were dead, and he reeked of stale coffee and cigarettes. Then there was Jenny, a single mom in her late 20s who was just trying to keep her head above water. She was always tired, always stressed, but she put on a brave face for her kid. I could see the fear in her eyes, though. The fear of failing, of not being enough. It was a fear I knew all too well. My boss, Mr. Jenkins, was a walking cliché. A middle-aged man with a beer gut and a receding hairline, he had a fake smile that never reached his eyes. He'd stroll around the office, barking orders, pretending he cared about our sales numbers, but it was clear he only cared about his own paycheck. He had this way of making you feel small, like you were nothing more than a cog in the machine, easily replaceable. And maybe we were. The job wasn't just soul-sucking, it was exhausting. I'd spend 8 hours a day on the phone trying to convince people to buy crap they didn't need. My throat was constantly sore, my head pounded from the endless rejection, and my self-esteem, which had never been high to begin with, took a nosedive. I'd go home every night feeling drained, empty, and questioning why I was even bothering. But what choice did I have? I needed to pay the rent, buy groceries, and keep the lights on. So I kept going, day after day, month after month, like a hamster on a wheel, running but never getting anywhere. Outside of work, things weren't much better. I didn't have any friends. I didn't know how to make them. Growing up in Maplewood, I'd never learned how to connect with people. The bullying had made me wary, distrustful. I kept to myself, avoiding eye contact, avoiding conversation. I'd go to work, come home, and spend the evening watching TV or reading. I rarely went out, and when I did, it was just to the grocery store or the laundromat. My life was monotonous, colorless. I was just existing, not living. Then one night, something happened that broke the monotony, but not in a good way. I was walking home from the bus stop after work. It was late, and the streets were mostly empty. The streetlights cast long shadows, and there was a chill in the air that made me pull my jacket tighter around me. As I turned the corner onto my block, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There was a man in the middle of the street, and he was fighting himself. At first, I thought he was just drunk or high, but the longer I watched, the more I realized this wasn't just some random drunk guy. He was really going at it, punching the air, kicking, even throwing himself to the ground. It was like he was in a full-blown brawl with an invisible opponent. I should have just kept walking, minded my own business, but something about the scene fascinated me. I don't know why. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of it, or maybe it was the fact that, in a weird way, I saw a bit of myself in him. I was constantly fighting my own demons too, just not in such a literal way. Whatever the reason, I stood there, watching as this guy continued to thrash around, muttering to himself, cursing at whatever it was he was seeing. Eventually, he must have noticed me because he stopped and stared right at me. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and there was a manic energy about him that made me uneasy. But instead of walking away, I did something incredibly stupid. I walked toward him. I don't know what possessed me to do it. When I got closer, I could see he was younger than I'd first thought, probably in his late 20s, like me. He was disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn, and there were bruises on his face that looked fresh. I asked him if he was okay, and to my surprise, he actually answered me. He started ranting about how he wasn't crazy, how he was fighting them off, how he couldn't let them win. It didn't make any sense. We ended up talking for hours right there on the sidewalk. His name was Jack, and he told me all about how he'd been dealing with these things, these invisible enemies that were out to get him. He said they were always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. At first, I thought he was just another paranoid schizophrenic, but the more he talked, the more I started to believe that maybe there was something to what he was saying. Not because it made sense, but because I could see he genuinely believed it. And in his belief, there was a kind of twisted logic that was almost convincing. By the time we parted ways that night, I felt like I'd met a kindred spirit. Jack was clearly disturbed, but he was also fighting against something he couldn't control, just like me. And in a weird way, that made me feel less alone. Over the next few weeks, I ran into Jack a few more times. Each time he was in a different state of disarray, sometimes more coherent, sometimes less. But he was always fighting, always struggling against these invisible foes. I started to get to know him better, and despite his madness, I began to see him as a friend. Maybe it was because he was the first person who actually seemed to see me, who didn't just look past me like I was invisible. Then one night, after we'd both had a few too many drinks at a dive bar near my apartment, Jack came up with an idea that was as insane as it was intriguing. He suggested we start a fight club, a place where people like us, people who were struggling with their own demons, could come together and fight, not just physically but mentally, emotionally. A place where we could let out all the anger, all the frustration, all the pain that we kept bottled up inside. At first, I laughed it off. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad movie. But the more Jack talked about it, the more I started to think that maybe he was onto something. Maybe a fight club was exactly what I needed. What we both needed. So, we did it. We started our own little club of weirdo fighters, as Jack called it. We found a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place where no one would bother us, and we started meeting there a few nights a week. At first, it was just me and Jack, but word got out, and before long, we had a small group of people who were just as messed up as we were, looking for a way to vent their frustrations, to feel something, anything. The fights were brutal, bloody, and cathartic. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about surviving, about pushing ourselves to the limit, about confronting our fears head on. The people who joined us were from all walks of life. There was Steve, a middle-aged accountant who was going through a nasty divorce. Sarah, a waitress who'd lost her daughter in a car accident and couldn't cope with the grief. And Marcus, a former soldier. They were all like us, broken in their own ways, looking for some kind of release. The fights gave us that release, but they also gave us something else. Camaraderie. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was part of something, part of a group that accepted me for who I was, no matter how damaged. It was dangerous, it was illegal, and it was probably insane. But it was also the first thing that had made me feel alive in years. But as with everything in my life, the good times couldn't last. Things started to spiral out of control. The fights got more intense, more violent. People started getting seriously hurt, and the line between the fights and real life began to blur. Jack, who'd always been on the edge, started to unravel even more. He became obsessed with the idea that our fight club was more than just a way to blow off steam, that it was a way to fight back against the things that were trying to destroy us. He started talking about taking the club to the next level, about making it something bigger, something more dangerous. One night, during a particularly brutal fight between Jack and a new guy who joined the club, something snapped. Jack went too far. He wasn't just fighting anymore. He was trying to kill the guy. It took 3 of us to pull him off. And even then, he was screaming, ranting about how he had to finish it, how he couldn't let them win. That night, as I sat in my apartment, nursing a black eye and a busted lip, I realized that our fight club had gone from being an outlet for our pain to something much darker, something that was starting to consume us. I knew I had to get out, but I didn't know how. I didn't want to leave Jack. Didn't want to abandon the only group of people who'd ever made me feel like I wasn't alone. But I could see that staying was a recipe for disaster. I'm not sure what to do next. The fight club was supposed to be a way to cope, but now it's just another thing that's dragging me down. And Jack, well, I'm worried about him. He's getting more and more unstable, and I'm afraid of what he might do, to himself or to someone else. After that night when Jack nearly killed someone in the ring, I knew things had to change. But the weird thing was, despite everything, I kept going back. The fight club had become a part of my life. A twisted, dangerous part, but a part nonetheless. I think part of me believed that if I could just get stronger, if I could just prove myself in that ring, then maybe everything else in my life would start to make sense. Maybe the pain, the anger, the emptiness, it would all fade away, replaced by this new identity I was forging with my fists. Over the next few months, the club continued to grow. Word spread, and more people started showing up at the warehouse. What had started as a small, almost secretive gathering of lost souls had turned into something bigger, something darker. It wasn't just about fighting anymore, it was about survival. The fights got more intense, more brutal, as if everyone was trying to exorcise their own demons through violence. And in a way, they were. I became one of the regulars, and with each fight I grew stronger, both physically and mentally. My body hardened, the muscles that had once been scrawny and weak becoming solid and powerful. But it wasn't just about the physical strength. The real change was happening inside. The fear that had once dominated my life was slowly being replaced by something else. Determination, resilience, maybe even a touch of madness. I wasn't the same person who had stumbled into that fight club months before. I was becoming something different. Someone who could face the world without flinching. Someone who wasn't afraid to take a hit and dish it out right back. But the thing about getting stronger is that it changes you in ways you don't always realize. The anger that had once simmered beneath the surface started to boil over, and I found myself lashing out. Not just in the ring, but in my everyday life. I'd snap at people for no reason, pick fights over the smallest things. It was like all the rage I'd bottled up for years was finally finding an outlet, and I couldn't control it. But at the same time, I didn't want to. That anger had become my fuel, driving me to push harder, fight stronger, and go further than I ever thought possible. Jack, on the other hand, was spiraling. The paranoia that had always been a part of him was getting worse, and it was starting to affect everything. He'd show up at the warehouse half-crazed, ranting about how they were watching us, how the fight club was the only thing keeping them at bay. It was hard to tell how much of it was real and how much was just in his head, but either way, it was clear he was losing control. One night, during a particularly intense fight, everything came to a head. The guy Jack was up against, some new guy named Rico, who'd been making waves in the club with his brutal no-nonsense style, wasn't backing down. Jack had been on a winning streak, but it was clear from the start that this fight was different. Rico wasn't just fighting to win, he was fighting to dominate, to crush his opponent in every way possible. The fight was brutal, bloody. Fists flew, bodies collided, and the sound of flesh hitting flesh echoed through the warehouse. At first, it seemed like just another night, another fight. But then something shifted. Jack started to lose his grip, not just on the fight, but on reality. He began to fight like a man possessed, swinging wildly, his eyes glazed over with a look of pure madness. Rico, sensing an opportunity, pressed the attack, landing blow after blow until Jack was on the ropes, barely able to stand. I could see it happening, but I couldn't move, couldn't stop it. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, horrifying but inevitable. Jack was down, bleeding, gasping for breath, but he refused to stay down. He got back up, again and again, each time more battered and broken than the last. But Rico didn't stop. He kept coming, relentless, until the final blow, a vicious right hook, sent Jack crashing to the ground. There was a sickening silence as Jack hit the concrete. For a moment it seemed like he might get back up, just like he always did, but he didn't. He lay there, motionless, his chest barely rising and falling. And then, nothing. The rise and fall stopped. The fight was over, but the cost was far greater than anyone could have anticipated. The club members rushed to Jack's side, but it was too late. He was gone. Jack, the guy who had brought us all together, who had started this whole thing, was dead. And we were all complicit in it. We had watched him spiral, watched him lose his grip, and done nothing. We had cheered him on, encouraged the madness, and now he was gone. The club members were in shock, trying to process what had happened. Some left, unable to handle the guilt. Others doubled down, throwing themselves into the fights with even more ferocity, as if trying to exercise their own guilt through violence. But for me, everything changed. Jack's death was a wake-up call. A brutal reminder of what this life could lead to if I didn't take control. I couldn't let Jack's death be in vain. I couldn't let the club spiral further into darkness. So, I made a decision. It was time to reorganize, to turn the Fight Club into something that could help us, not destroy us. The first thing I did was lay down new rules. The fights would still happen, but they would be more controlled, less about mindless violence and more about discipline and skill. I started bringing in trainers, people who knew what they were doing, who could teach us how to fight properly, how to channel our anger into something constructive. We started training together, working on techniques, building strength, endurance, and mental fortitude. The fights became less about survival and more about growth, about pushing ourselves to be better, stronger, smarter. I also introduced something new: group discussions. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about understanding why we were fighting, what we were trying to achieve. We started talking about our issues, our fears, our anger. At first it was awkward. We were a bunch of broken people, not used to opening up, not used to being vulnerable. But slowly, those walls started to come down. We began to see each other not just as opponents, but as allies in this strange, twisted journey. It was a reminder of how easily things could go wrong, of how close we all were to the edge. I knew that we could never forget what happened to him, and that was part of the reason why I was so determined to make the club into something better, something that could actually help people. I started reaching out to others, people outside of the original circle, people who might benefit from what we were building. I found a few veterans who were struggling with PTSD, some young guys who were getting mixed up in gang life, and even a couple of women who had escaped abusive relationships. They all came with their own baggage, their own demons, but that was what made them fit in. We were all fighting something, and in the ring, we could confront those things head on. But I wasn't naive. I knew that this new direction for the club wasn't a magic fix. We were still dealing with real issues, and the Fight Club wasn't going to solve everything. But it was a start. It was something positive, something that gave us purpose, a reason to keep going. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was actually doing something that mattered. Looking back, I realized that I've come a long way from the scared, lonely kid I was in Maplewood. I'm stronger now, both physically and mentally. But that strength came at a cost. I've seen things, done things that I'm not proud of. I've lost people I cared about, people who could have been saved if I'd been smarter, quicker, more aware. Jack's death will always be a part of me. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if this new version of the club will succeed, or if it will crumble under the weight of our collective pain. But I do know that for now, it's the only thing that's keeping me going. And maybe that's enough. I decided to reorganize the Fight Club. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that doesn't stand out in any way until something happens to burn it into your memory forever. I was walking to work, just like any other day, when out of nowhere, a car came screeching around the corner, tires squealing. At first, I thought it was just some idiot driving too fast, but then I noticed the car wasn't trying to avoid me. It was aiming straight for me. This wasn't an accident. Someone was trying to kill me. I barely had time to react. I threw myself to the side, hitting the pavement hard, just as the car sped past, missing me by inches. I could feel the rush of air as it flew by, the smell of burning rubber filling my nostrils. I lay there for a moment, stunned, my body aching from the impact, my mind racing. Why would someone want to kill me? The Fight Club had its share of enemies, people who didn't like what we were doing, who thought we were a menace. But this felt different. This was personal. I could feel it in my bones. When I finally managed to get up, I looked around, half expecting the car to come back for another pass. But it was gone, leaving nothing but a trail of skid marks and the lingering scent of exhaust. I stood there, trembling, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Was this connected to the club? To Jack's death? Or was it something else entirely? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep going on like this. The Fight Club had given me strength, but it had also put a target on my back. I had to make a choice. Keep running, keep fighting, or take control of my life once and for all. The first thing I did was call the police. I knew they wouldn't be much help. After all, what could they do about a car that was already gone? But I had to report it, if only to have it on record. The officer who took my statement seemed skeptical, like he thought I was just some paranoid nutcase. I couldn't blame him. My story sounded insane, even to me, but that wasn't the end of it. After I filed the report, I started getting calls. At first they were just hang-ups, but then the voice on the other end started talking. It was always the same, someone breathing heavily, whispering threats. "We're watching you. You can't hide. You're next." The voice was distorted, mechanical, like they were using a voice changer. I had no idea who it was, but the message was clear. Whoever had tried to run me down wasn't done with me yet. I tried to go about my life as usual, but it was impossible. Every time I walked down the street, every time I turned a corner, I was looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The fear was consuming me, and I knew that if I didn't do something soon, it would destroy me. That's when I made the decision to take things to the next level. The Fight Club had started as a way to survive, but now it was time to turn it into something more. Something that could protect us. Something that could give us power. Not just in the ring, but in the world. I couldn't keep fighting in the shadows. I needed to bring the fight into the light. So, I rented an old gym on the outskirts of town. It was a rundown place, the kind of building that had seen better days decades ago. The paint was peeling, the roof leaked when it rained, and the equipment was ancient. But it had character, and more importantly, it was ours. With the help of the other members of the club, we cleaned it up, fixed what we could, and turned it into something new. Our headquarters, our sanctuary. We officially opened the club to the public, not as an underground fight club, but as a legitimate gym. We offered classes, boxing, MMA, self-defense, anything that could help people learn to fight, to protect themselves. But it wasn't just about the physical training. We also started holding workshops on mental toughness, on dealing with trauma, on finding strength in the face of adversity. It became a place where people could come not just to fight, but to heal. And it worked. We even started getting attention from the local community, from the media. What we were doing was new, different, and people wanted to be a part of it. But the threats didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. The calls became more frequent, the messages more ominous. "You think you're safe? You're not. We're coming for you." I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone out there wanted me dead, and I had to find out who it was before they succeeded. That's when I decided to start my own investigation into Jack's death. I'd always had a feeling there was more to it than just a simple fight gone wrong. But now I was sure of it. Jack had been paranoid, convinced that they were after him. And now it seemed like they were after me too. But who were they? And what did they want? I started digging, going through Jack's old things, looking for anything that might give me a clue. I talked to the other members of the club, trying to piece together the last few weeks of Jack's life. The more I dug, the more I realized that Jack had been involved in something much bigger than just the Fight Club. He'd been meeting with people, talking about things that made no sense. Conspiracies, secret organizations, a shadowy group that was pulling the strings behind the scenes. At first, it all sounded like the ramblings of a madman, but the more I looked into it, the more I started to believe that Jack might have been onto something. There were too many coincidences, too many unexplained events. Jack had been scared, and now I was starting to understand why. The deeper I went, the more dangerous it became. I started getting followed, my apartment was broken into, and one night, I found a threatening note slipped under my door. "Stop digging, or you'll end up like him." But I couldn't stop. I was in too deep, and I had to know the truth. Eventually, I uncovered something that changed everything. Jack had been investigating a powerful, clandestine group that operated in the shadows, a group with ties to organized crime, corrupt politicians, and even law enforcement. He'd stumbled onto something big, something they didn't want anyone to know about, and when he got too close, they silenced him. The revelation shook me to my core. Jack hadn't just died in a fight, he'd been murdered, and now I was in their crosshairs. The Fight Club had started as a way to cope, but now it had become a battleground in a much larger war. I realized that if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to protect the people I cared about, I had to be smart. I had to play their game, but on my terms. So I went to the police with what I'd found. At first, they didn't take me seriously. But after I showed them the evidence, emails, phone records, notes Jack had left behind, they started to see the bigger picture. An investigation was launched, and suddenly, everything changed. The gym became a focal point, not just for us, but for the authorities as well. They started watching us, monitoring our activities, waiting for the people behind Jack's death to make a move. And they did. It didn't take long for the threats to escalate. One night the gym was broken into, ransacked. They didn't just trash the place. They left a message, spray-painted on the wall in blood-red letters. "This is your last warning." But by then, it was too late for warnings. The investigation was in full swing, and the police were closing in on the people responsible. They started making arrests. Small fish at first. But it wasn't long before they caught the big players, the ones who had been pulling the strings all along. It turned out that Jack had been right. They were connected to some of the most powerful people in the city, and their reach was far greater than I had ever imagined. But the takedown came at a cost. We lost members. Some left out of fear, others were targeted and hurt. The gym was vandalized multiple times, and we had to fight to keep it open. But through it all, we persevered. The investigation dragged on for months, eventually reached a dead end, and was closed due to lack of witnesses and evidence. Some of the people responsible for Jack's death were brought to justice. Some of my friends went missing. When I found out that the investigation was closed, I realized that the danger was not over. But that didn't stop me. I've had enough of fear. I'm going to act. In the aftermath, the gym became more than just a place to fight. It became a symbol of resilience, of survival. We officially registered it as a non-profit, offering free classes to underprivileged youth, veterans, and survivors of abuse. We started outreach programs, connecting with other organizations to help those who were struggling. The Fight Club had evolved into something far greater than I had ever imagined. A community, a family, a place where people could find strength in their darkest hours. It's hard to believe how far we've come. From the broken, angry kid I was in Maplewood, to the scared young man who stumbled into an underground fight club, to the person I am now, someone who has faced down his demons and come out the other side. I'm not the same person I was, and I'm grateful for that. The Fight Club, the gym, the people I've met along the way, they've all helped shape me into someone I can finally be proud of. But there's still a part of me that's haunted by what happened, by Jack's death, by the violence, by the darkness that nearly consumed us all. I carry that with me, every day. But I also carry the knowledge that we made it through, that we survived, and that we're still fighting. But this time, we're fighting for something better. So, that's my story. It's been a long, twisted journey, and it's not over yet. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm on the right path. The gym is thriving, the community we've built is strong, and the Fight Club has become something positive, something that can make a difference. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm ready for it. I'm not afraid anymore. I've been through hell and back, and I've come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. Life is a fight, and I've learned how to take the hits and keep going. So, if you're reading this and you're struggling, if you feel like you're on the edge, just know that there's a way through. It's not easy, and it's not pretty, but it's possible. You just have to keep fighting, keep pushing forward, and never give up. Because at the end of the day, that's what life is. One long, brutal fight. And as long as you're still standing, you're winning.